so people know when I'm going to do these streams. Usually I work so much I have to do them like impromptu, so I don't really have time to kind of like advertise them ahead of time. Apologies. I'm trying to fix my work schedule so I can get better at that. And I'll put this in here. All right, there's a few people in the chat, so I'm gonna jump into what I wanted to talk about, and I hope that I can get some feedback from the people watching as well. Hold on one sec. I'm gonna pull it up on here. Okay, awesome. So last week I talked about an article that came out in the Toronto Sun about immigration to Canada. Mass immigration was at about 300,000 a year, and now the Liberal government basically is going to up it to 400,000 a year by basically letting in everyone that applies that meets a certain criteria, mostly unvetted. So if you qualify as being intersectional or having like two or more identities in one, like you're a mixed race person or something, then you're going to get fast tracked into Canada. So this is, in my opinion, bad for multiple reasons. One, they're skipping over doing proper vetting, so we're just going to get people that have criminal records and records of doing bad stuff getting into the country. Quality type of people we don't want is bad. And then two, we're talking about immigration levels that are at a large scale, not at a small scale. We're talking about large scale immigration that will equal demographic replacement over not even a long term, but even a medium term. And the demographic replacement also will bring a certain bioculture replacement with it as well. However, the bioculture that it's replacing is also becoming obsolete simultaneously for other reasons. So it's a complicated problem because it's not by bioculture, I mean the type of Western civilization that we have in Canada, or the type of modern Western country like Canada that we have, that was an offshoot or was generated by Euro Canadians to begin with, that laid sort of a framework, that was then expanded upon by other people. And that the nature of it, of the law codes and the language and the social customs and the culture basically in general are being eroded anyway by just basically by modernity and consumer culture and everything else that's going on. But immigration and ethnic replacement will add to that. So to clarify, while I'm not a white nationalist and my the politics that I vote for and stuff are not race-based, I do have a nuanced appreciation for the complexity of racial pragmatic implications when you're talking about mass immigration, and which most people don't. So if you don't take time every now and again to sit down and kind of really spell it out for people or link things together, most people just they don't pick up on that, especially because we're in an Orwellian culture where we're being bombarded with propaganda all the time. So there's a few books I'm going to use here too to make some points. One thing too, a lot of people mischaracterize me because of stuff over time as being a conservative, but I'm definitely not really a conservative because there's not much I'm trying to conserve other than sort of Western culture anyway. So in terms of mainstream conservatism, I'm definitely not a conservative. Excuse me. Not even right wing really, because a lot of this stuff is just more about, it's not even on a spectrum like that. It's just more about pragmatic understandings of what's going on. So there's a couple of different ways to view things that are going on in Canada right now. There's Canada in Decay. Ricardo Duchesne, he put out a book, and this would be considered like a dissident right take on things. And this is also a book that I recommend to everybody that watches this channel. It's called Canada in Decay: Mass Immigration, Diversity, and the Ethnocide of Euro Canadians. Very interesting take, and I really like it because he defines things very clearly, and then he lays out a chronological history of Canada, and he really makes a solid argument for his points, in my opinion. Then there's sort of other takes on Canada, like this was a book from a little while back that I remember reading, A Fair Country, and this is by John Ralston Saul, who's like a left-wing academic, and was married to Canada's former Governor General for a while. He presents things in this book that kind of run in a different vein than Duchesne, right? And then there's a lot of other books on Canada you can read. And really, if you are a Canadian and you want to be patriotic and you want to really understand Canada, you should read a broad range of history books from the right and the left so that you can appreciate kind of a spectrum of opinion and stuff. And everyone has their bias too, right? So it's always good to have more range of views to draw on, and then also you can kind of decide on which you think are worth getting into. One of the things that I really like about Ricardo's book, if you read it, is that he really gets into or he does a really good job of just really explaining what the modern globalist slash multicultural ideology is that's being taught in universities, because like he gets right into, there's a few specific academics that have written very specific books that are kind of used as the seminal texts of, I guess, the ideology. I don't know how to word this. The main theory that's always referred to by these political theories. I'm trying to find the name. I used to refer to him all the time, and I can't remember. But in the first chapter, just in the very first chapter, it's been a couple of years since I read this. He gets into. I'd have to go through this and find the exact definition, but he does a really good job of defining and laying out for you the names of and they're Canadian academics too. Treblecock. Okay, that's one of them. The Making of the Mosaic by Kelly and Treblecock is a book, is an academic book that presents a narrative of Canadian history that Ricardo disagrees with. Okay, I'll go so far as to say that I agree with Ricardo when he says that the history that they're teaching in university now is basically all a lie. It's lying with statistics and reframing things in basically a dishonest way. And the reason for that is a political agenda, because Canadian history is basically extremely white. I mean, when you get into actually, yes, other ethnicities outside of white Europeans were in Canada throughout its history, but in terms of statistics, the majority of it, the vast majority, is white people. So now that Canada is transitioning into a multicultural sort of neo-Marxist, neo-feudalist, dystopian, whatever it is, the politicians and the academics and the school curriculum needs to adapt and have a broader education that appeals to all these other people. So they Marxify it, they kind of basically lie about it, or they work it out so that it's distorted and basically takes away from the honest truth of it. And like I said, the honest truth is that most of Canadian history is basically a product of white Canadians. You can talk about the Chinese building the railroads and this and that, and all of that's addressed in these books, but that's in terms of proportion. It doesn't really amount to much, not in terms of the amount of people here or even statistically quantified. I mean, doing labor is one thing, but that's not what we mean when we're talking about establishing a nation in terms of law codes, language, social norms and customs, which are obviously all Euro-Canadian. When I say that, I say all within the context, right? Because obviously Canada as a nation state is what was a bicultural nation, to be more specific. It's Euro-Canadian and Aboriginal, traditional, Native North Americans, which is also a reason why I think that the Marxist agenda today is kind of tragic for Native Americans, because they're basically getting suckered into trading away being part of a bicultural identity of Canada into just making it Marxist, which actually will give them a much smaller share of the pie. So it's a shame that they have basically been manipulated politically so much. But anyway, Canada was, it was a fusion of basically Anglos, Quebecois, and Native Americans that were already here. That's what it is. And there are some terms that get thrown around all the time, and people, especially in casual conversation, and I don't waste time depending on the context. But one thing you have to understand is there's a big difference between immigration, or settlers and pioneers, and immigrants in general. And just to sketch out for you a general understanding of Canadian history, North America is one of the American continents populated by multiple groups of Aboriginal people, Native Americans throughout Canada, right, from coast to coast, different tribes. Then eventually you start to get immigration from there's no nation state either. You have nations of people that are mostly nomadic or have territory but are hunter gatherers, right? They're nations of people spread across the continent, basically at a Stone Age existence because they don't have metallurgy or agriculture or written language or anything like that yet. Then, starting around roughly 1500, you start to get immigrants crossing the ocean from Europe, which are primarily from two groups, England and France. So they start land and they slowly start to colonize this part of, well, the continent, but really initially it's just certain regions. Um, Pioneers are coming here and they start to try to establish colonies, which eventually become nation states with states, not just nations. Nations are groups of people. States are literally the group or the thing that has the power to enforce control over a territory. So usually you have a nation state is when you combine those two things. And they bring with them modern European civilization, which includes metallurgy, agriculture, written language, those types of things. Over time, and this is a big thing too. The Europeans that are coming here, they're not immigrants like today's people. When immigrants are coming to Canada today from outside of the West, they're usually upgrading their life. They're coming from a lower standard of existence into modernity. The initial pioneers that were coming here are settler pioneers. They're leaving Europe, they're coming to an undeveloped place and they're developing it. This is important for pragmatically when you're understanding bioculture, because you have to have a civilization that literally builds itself up out of nothing to begin with. It doesn't just inherit it. And to build it up, you have to have discipline and you have all kinds of social norms that get people to work together intergenerationally, and for something more than just themselves to actually establish that. Not all groups do that, so they don't appreciate that. A lot of people, they feel entitled to inherit things, but they don't understand what went into creating it. And the social norms they bring with them are not the social norms that were used to build that thing up that they now want to benefit from. So that's why this is all worth talking about, right? Over time, the nation state of Canada is formed, which is basically a fusion of the Quebecois, Anglos, and like I said, their relationship with the Native Americans. There are only, these are, in the beginning, these are only settler pioneers, and eventually you start to get more Germans and a few other things. But there have only been intermittent periods in time where Canada actually had large-scale immigration. They're laid out very clearly statistically in Canada in Decay, early 1900s, and then a few direct. It's a lie that Canada, the floodgates have always just been open for anyone to immigrate here. That's not true. And it was really only in the late 60s and around 1970 that things were just like changed strategically to start bringing in all these other outsiders. Initially, Canada is a settler pioneer nation of Europeans basically establishing a nation state in America with the Native Americans. So that is the truth. History textbooks now want to imply all the influences and paint Canada as being this diverse mosaic all the way along, but statistically that's just not true. All of the Duchesne does a really good job of going into like the census data and just really laying out the statistics. Like, besides being rhetorical, like most left-wing academics are very rhetorical these days, this is just really like hard to argue with the straight facts of immigration and the time periods. Here, I just opened it to one page. Just to make a point, I'm going to read 2 pages from the early beginning of this book, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Also, I see there's a comment in the chat. It says, have you read Conrad Black's Canadian history book, Rise to Greatness? It seemed a fair representation. I've never read that one, but at this point in time, I like collecting books on Canadian history almost. It's become like a subsection of my library, and I like to collect history books of Canada just to show, like as a historian, how things change. So I'm going to put that on my list, and I appreciate the suggestion. I'll look into that. In Canada in Decay, in the beginning of the chapter, Canada Anglicized and Whitened, it says demographic and cultural impact of immigration 1896 to 1914/21. So Canada had been slowly developing as colonies, through the 1700s, 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. That's when we're talking about here. Duchesne says, when all is said, the historians agree that it was really in the period between 1896 and 1914 that Canada saw a high influx of immigrants, more than 3 million. There is no doubt that immigrants, particularly if we correctly include their children, did play a very important role in the population growth Canada experienced from around 5 million in 1896 to just under 8 million in 1914. Mind you, if you compare the estimation of more than 3 million immigrants to the number of population growth, the increase in population from 1896 to 1914 stands lower than the alleged number of immigrants, which leads one to think that the immigration numbers have been exaggerated, since the number of Canadians should have been considerably higher in 1914 if we take account of the domestic fertility rate, even assuming that some of these immigrants immigrated to the US and that some died. That's another point I wanted to clarify too, just for people to understand this. There's a difference between a country that grows through immigration, which is what people think Canada was, which is a country that kept growing because people kept immigrating here, and a country that grows because a group of people come here and establish themselves as a colony and then grow through fertility rate. So that's why I don't see the Quebecois as being Europeans, really, as more so Euro-Canadians, aboriginal to the soil, is because most of them were born with a high fertility rate in the Quebec, the colony of Quebec. You know, I think it was more than 5 kids on average for like the early like generations. So most of the growth of Euro Canadians are Canadians giving birth to their own offspring in Canada. They're not immigrating more people, and that's so what we're having today. What we're seeing today is there's a bunch of rhetoric and narratives that have been twisted to confuse people, and basically what's happening is the economy is all fucked up, and we need to keep bringing in mass amounts of people for economic reasons, so that one, to make sure that older people have pensions, so that their pension funds don't run out, and so that the GDP doesn't drop too low, and for a bunch of reasons. So basically, we're just replacing the native Canadians, people like me, and a whole demographics of like white Euro Canadians, and then just other even non-white Canadians that have just been here for generations. That the economy's all fucked up, so we can't really get good jobs, and so older people worried about their pensions are like, well, you know what the solution is? We just need to mass immigrate lots of foreigners. And then the government's putting a spin on this by adding all their Marxist ideology to it, so that we don't bring in any other white people. And the average white person they don't understand the proportionality of white people in the global picture. They don't understand what percentage of the world population we make up, how small we are, how fast we're declining. So it's all quite alarming. And most leftists, I think, or at least the ones that I do, kind of do understand this, but they're dishonest, because you'll see this all the time. You'll see people arguing online. They'll be making fun of people that they perceive as right-wing or like PPC voters and stuff. When people express concerns about like demographic replacement, they'll be mocked by the left, and they'll say, oh, that's just a conspiracy theorist and you're stupid and all this. But then later on in the same conversation, often, if they get flustered or upset, they start making fun of you and saying, we're replacing you, and they start gloating about it. So they're inconsistent, even in their own conversations, in one conversation. So I can see what's going on here. Everyone does basically understand this. And it's not good, because basically in a bigger picture, what I get at too is like I've been having discussions in different groups that I'm in on Facebook and social media groups, free speech groups and stuff like that. People really, they don't understand bioculture and how it works, and they tend to look at it from the bottom up instead of the top down. And while individuals can obviously move to places and learn to adapt to culture, they don't understand how culture itself is basically the unique expression of ethnic groups. That's why Eastern cultures like China are so different than European cultures. And in other streams I've done it. Hold on, I'm going to show this one book just a second. I like to study a lot of different fields, right? And so I do study evolutionary psychology a lot, and I'm heavily influenced by it in my own thinking, even though it's not the be-all, end-all, and I understand that, because I'm not really a Darwinian, and I believe in evolution, but that's there's more than just that process. But still, I've recommended books like this, Individualism and the Western Liberal Tradition, and I've read a lot of books like Faustian Man in a Multicultural Age is another favorite book of mine, and I'm really, you see on the behind me maps of Europe and different stuff. A lot of the stuff that I'm into, even for like entertainment's sake, like literature, like the stuff I'm into now, I've developed a huge appreciation for like European culture as an extension of like, I guess, even doing this channel for the last 5 years, right? Because the more I've researched, the more of like, and I value European history, especially since it's being slowly systemically erased. That's why I'm always telling people to like collect these books, read these books. You got to keep it alive, sort of like as a counter narrative to the propaganda they teach, if you value it, right? So anyway, a lot of people, they don't have an appreciation for like all the stuff talked about in these books about how Western civilization was generated. The over time, the different influences. I mean, you really have to appreciate that like Western individualism is unique, and there's different reasons that it evolved the way it did over time that include the physical environment, like Northern Europe, and how harsh it is to live, and how sparse the population is, and how it's not an agricultural thing, so people move around and they don't have to guard their territory as much, and therefore don't have to worry about strategic marriage and things like that. You have to appreciate all this, and then you have to appreciate cultural factors like Christianity and its evolution within Europe over centuries. All of this stuff matters, and a lot of people tend to be, um, even if they don't realize it, they're kind of racial Marxists because they don't understand. They also think that I'm arguing like a sort of racial determinism, which I'm not really getting at. But I'm saying there's an appreciation that people don't understand, but for biology and culture, and because they don't understand that, they don't understand why it's a bad thing to replace certain ethnic groups, right, for political reasons. And so I'm trying to show you, or I'm trying to point out that this is more nuanced and complex than the typical normie ever thinks about. There's strategic, there's both pragmatic reasons why I oppose mass immigration and ethnic replacement, and then there's moral reasons too. Like I just think it is for when you're, it, like I'm against it morally and pragmatically, because pragmatically it will destabilize the West and get rid of the bioculture that generated the freedom and all that. But that stuff's going away anyway for all the other reasons. So that's why it's kind of like maybe whatever. It's hard not to be black-pilled these days. But then also more like morally, I just think it's like wrong to basically target a group of people out of jealousy. A lot of it's based in jealousy too. When you really get in like just nastiness, like it's not oversimplifying it when all these academics talk about Marxism as being like literally generated and run on spite and resentfulness of it. When people become adults, the unsuccessful ones are the ones that are just not good characters. They do become resentful, and over time they become very toxic. I don't know I don't know what other word to use for these people. It's ideology than toxicity. It's just not self-evident to people at first. The more experience you have with it, the more you understand that. So yeah, in this stream, I basically wanted to lay out that people kind of forget some of these points. Like Canada is a nation of settlers, not immigrants. Today, when you're bringing in all these people that are having big upgrades in their standard of living, that's not the same as all these people that had to work hard and then beginning to come here and hack out an existence out of the bush. And then they grew through high birth rate. They didn't import people. So that narrative, people need to remember that. And then second of all, they need to realize that yes, like historically, Canada is a country, a nation of, it's basically a bicultural Native American and Euro-Canadian fusion of those groups. It was never a Marxist multiracial mosaic history. It's not. And then they have to realize that even, I'm not saying that people need to become like racial identitarians or anything, but they just need to appreciate the link between biology and culture and why it's not a good idea to erase certain groups. And then I also just wanted to hype some of these books because, like, an ongoing theme of this channel is free speech, which is basically dead, so it's become more about historical revisionism and trying to keep the truth alive, and the internet is completely biased now. Google search results are biased. Wikipedia is just a biased thing, that was rewritten by leftists, all of that stuff. So people need to buy and read these books if they want to be self-educated on European history. And yes, to clarify, I have this deep love now for the sophistication of European civilization, and in one context, I'm a bit of a European exceptionalist, but I'm also, I have this deep love of other cultures too, which is why like I'm people. I see people that are kind of too ethnocentric, I guess, but without giving like credit where it's due. I actually love diversity, and that's why I also kind of lean towards generally nationalism over globalism, because nationalism is true diversity. The Japanese are a culture that are very different in many ways than my European culture that I come out of. But I have a deep admiration and respect for them on many issues and in many ways, right? Like I can respect difference and even admire it. Not on everything, of course. That's why we do have ultimately some different values and natural preferences that are just different culturally. But I'm saying you can definitely have a love for your own background, and then also I recommend like just being aware of the uniqueness of other cultures, because I think that a lot of these liberal types and these like cultural Marxists, when you don't actually appreciate the nuanced the differences between groups of people can often be beautiful, right? Like, but they're differences, and these Marxists, because they're wanting they want everything to be the same and transmutable and so on, like culturally, that they don't understand that the unique cultural things that make people that the uniqueness of people. And think about this: if you believe in evolution and you can see that different groups of people being isolated from each other in different environments on the planet for prolonged periods of millennia, 60 to 200,000 years in different environments like Africa and Northern Europe, clearly result in physical differences, genetic drift. We're all human beings, right? But there's genetic drift going on here. So it clearly results in a genetic drift of the physical body. Why would there not be drift of the psychology as well? Because we do develop psychological mechanisms over the generations in response to environmental conditions, that and it's not dishonest to acknowledge that. There's no problem with that. And these would obviously play into the way that that groups of people express themselves culturally in those environments. So, well, yes, individuals can obviously immigrate to other places and adapt to that culture. That's not saying that groups of people en masse naturally generate those cultures, or would naturally generate them, and when you don't appreciate the uniqueness of different cultures, then I think it's easy to miss that, And another thing I've talked about before is that, when I was younger, I spent a lot of time and money getting an arts degree or becoming like self-educating, not for career reasons, but try to be a well-rounded intellectual. And then for a while I regretted that, because it takes, it's economically hard to recover when you don't go into a trade or a STEM field. Now I don't regret it, because I'm glad, when I did my English degree, it was a 4-year honors degree, right? So I do these courses like African Lit and Native American Lit and South Asian Lit, and I'd be reading their literature, and then also taking random arts courses like anthropology and stuff. And so having all that, and like education was continuously downgrading in quality, right? But I graduated in like 2006 or something. No, that was from Humber. From Carleton, I probably graduated like 2011 or 12. I have to go back and check. But, I still got it pretty good. I got, the classics, Shakespeare and all the Western canon. And then what I'm saying is that the literature courses from other cultures actually kind of act as like an anthropology class as well, because you have to study the culture that the book is coming out of. And then you like, sometimes literature is better than a textbook, because like usually most of these, like for example, African literature is almost all female writers, right? And it's almost the same for like Native American lit. So you're getting women's kind of like expressing themselves and their own frustrations and lived experiences, in this way that you're not going to even see in a textbook. So there's value in all this stuff that most people don't see. Like all of my friends, because I'm a working class guy, and I'm more of a blue collar guy, and I respect the trades and small business. I have a lot of friends who are mostly entrepreneurs or business type, and they're all like they're all doing well because they have skilled trades, and I should have one too. We actually all young men should be encouraged to go when they're younger, but they also usually don't the same. Like I have friends in the STEM fields and they don't appreciate the arts, and then I have friends that went into like the skilled trades and they do well financially, but they don't appreciate it. But the difference is that's also why huge amounts of the population now are easy to brainwash and manipulate, because they don't really know anything outside of their narrow field of existence, really. Like so I recommend that we should all try to be like we should all young men should have a skilled trade so that you can make money, but then you should be like self-educating. You shouldn't pay money anymore to go to university, but you should like, I mean, not everyone can be everything either. Not everyone values everything, but like to be a well-rounded man, you should be physically fit, and then you should be like reading, like self-educating on top of like having a job, right? Once you get older, you can't balance all that necessarily with being a parent and having a family and all that. But when you're younger, you should try. And pros and cons. I don't have a family right now, right? So I'm older and I've had time to do. I can work a full-time job, train physically every day, and still read books and do all this because I have time, which is in one sense a blessing, right? But anyway, I was kind of rambling, but the point is you should try to self-educate and like just continually develop your intellect, because it makes you less easy to manipulate and less susceptible to all this propaganda. And the book recommendations are just so that you can like, the school is basically what the education basically amounts to lies. And if you want to just know the truth, then you should have these books. And if like, I'm not like the word patriotism kind of has lost any meaning anymore, but if you are a bit older and you value the old Canadian, there's some books that are cool to have on your shelf. Like this book, I never even got around to reading the whole thing. I actually bought it on Amazon like a year ago because I read a review of it and somebody was like, "This is white supremacist garbage and shame on this some SJW," and it only had one rating with thumbs down. And I looked it over and it looked kind of like cool. It was called "The Story of Canada" by George R. Brown, and it was like $10 or something. So I ordered it, and it's written in the form of like a lot of it's like in fictional form, but it's got a lot of black and white drawings. And this is the like kind of the standard kind of history of Canada that I was raised on. It talks a lot about the Coureur de Bois and the French settlers and the struggles with the Native Americans. And I always thought Native American culture was super cool, by the way, too. Like when I was growing up, I grew up in a rural area, and so we were always outside playing and like cowboys and Indians and stuff like that. And there's a lot of historical sites for that, like with involving Native Americans. I was always fascinated by the Native American culture and thought it was like super cool, and like respected it. And I never really felt like anybody I knew was racist towards any of it. We all thought it was awesome. And I also lived near this historical site that had all this stuff that was like historical left over from the War of 1812. And every year in the fall, they used to have this big historical reenactment, and all of these like guys would come and like dress up in full like colonial costumes with guns and everything. And Native American or like Native guys would come from the reserves in full like tribal stuff, and they'd have this giant full day long reenactment of all these battles, and locals would come and sit on this hill and you could watch the whole thing. It's like one of my favorite memories of growing up, and doesn't really have it anymore for obvious reasons, but back then it was like a big team. Everyone was in on it. Like there were all these white guys dressed up. There were all these like Aboriginal guys there, and they looked super cool, right? Like the Aboriginal guys with all their like costumes on and their weapons and stuff, and they do the whole thing. And that it's really loud because they also would have cannons. And they were always like shooting guns, and it was all blanks, but it was like really really loud. So as a kid, I remember being like, shit. But watching it was all awesome. Everyone would run across the fields and like shoot each other, bash each other, and like fall over and play dead or whatever. These reenactment things, they were cool to witness. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, this was a cheap book, and but I like it. And if you wanted to support like this guy, it's good. My favorite book, history book about Canada growing up when I was a kid was this one. I got it was like in third grade, The Story of Canada, which to this day I think is a very awesome, fair book overall. Starts off. Also, I've always like had a big thing for like I just like hunter-gatherer cultures, right? Nomadic stuff. Paleolithic stuff, so it talks about like the first peoples and all. Obviously starts off with the Aboriginal groups, then it starts to get into the illustrations were really what made this book for me. And yeah, as a kid, I don't know, I always just found like colonial times to be fascinating. Liked movies about it, the warfare, and just just a cool, very very fascinating period of history. America has sort of a cooler history with their founding fathers and the Revolutionary War and all that. In Canada, we're kind of like simps later on, but the early settlers are pretty badass, you got to admit. And then this book gets into later modern Canada and does a good job of just representing like talks about World War One, World War Two, right up to modern day suffrage and and then has a really good chronology back. Anyway, funny thing I learned from this book going through it is I didn't realize until like a couple years ago when I reread this book that how times change. The whole free trade fiasco, which is really just a globalism, right, was brought in by the conservative government of Canada, the Mulroney, I think, and it was the NDP back then that were like highly opposed to it, which is a much more nationalistic position, right, to be opposed to NAFTA and free trade. And for the conservatives to be for it is the opposite of conserving anything. It really was just business. It's just money, and it was just like business people wanting to expand their market and be able to move to wherever the labor was cheapest. So like why people would support that, I don't know. But yeah, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney had to fight hard to win the 1988 election. The big issue was his Canada-U.S. free trade agreement. How ironic that back then the NDP were the voice of reason. Anyway, my favorite Canadian history book that I own is this one, The Story of Canada by Jeanette Lunn and Christopher Moore, illustrated by Alan Daniel. But like I said, everyone should own Canada in Decay. I also take, I only recommend it, or I only pointed out like one left-wing take on Canadian history here, but remember that like most of my education is basic. Like a lot of it was sort of like everything. I didn't read any right wing stuff really in university, so it's almost by definition like all the whole degree and like a lot of that stuff is was mostly like subtly being inculcated with the whole leftist perspective. So I'm more or less pointing out stuff that like you any textbook. Like I have a bunch. I saved most of my textbooks from university. I have a bunch of sociology books over there. I'll give you an example. Hold on. Well, I'm giving books that I think are relevant because, like, here's this, for example, like, my sister went to Lakehead University. She let me have some of her textbooks afterwards. This was a sociology textbook, right? When I go through it and the way it talks about Canada, yeah, like, because I'm older now and I'm very, like, I know a lot of stuff, I can go through this and recognize how biased it is as a textbook. And it's extremely, like, for lack of a more technical term, it's just a very left-wing book overall. So just you should read all the but when like mainstream and left wing are almost synonymous when I'm talking, so you should read all the mainstream stuff so you're familiar with that, but then counter that with these other books I'm suggesting. And obviously I'm a white guy, so I really value European history because it's my history, but you don't necessarily have to be white to value this stuff or to appreciate it. I guess that's what I was getting at when I was saying like I value like Native American history and Japanese history and everything. Like you can definitely like be you can study, if you're not white, you can still look at European history and study it honestly without having to like warp it into some Marxist perspective, even because just because you're not European. But for anybody that is really wants to really understand European history from a more nuanced perspective that you're not going to get in a mainstream way, you should definitely need to have Canada in Decay by Ricardo Duchesne and Individualism and the Western Liberal Tradition by Kevin MacDonald. You should have both of those. Also, like keep in mind Canada, like the West, we're definitely not a white supremacist nation. By definition, we're multicultural. Western Europeans generated the least ethnocentric society ever. Keep that in mind too. And there's also good videos I've seen. I'll link one in the description after by a Daniel Natal video pointing out that relative to like more primitive cultures, Westerners actually have a huge rates of reciprocity and trust. Not less. So there's a lot of really good stuff that was generated by Western civilization that you don't find outside of it, and that's all worth keeping in mind. Sorry, just looking at the chat again for a second. Someone says, I'm pursuing a degree in engineering, so my experience is different from an arts degree, but in my experience, my education has been a good quality. You can't lie about math. Yeah, very true. Engineering is a good field to go into. When I was in my 20s, I was dating this girl for like 7 years, and she became an electrical engineer. So we were dating just before she started university. And though I was doing an arts degree, I kind of saw her go through the whole electrical engineering program at Mac, and got to know a lot of engineers because I'm sure you know, there's engineers tend to be a type, like a personality type when you're at university, and they have all their social functions and all these gatherings and stuff. And I'd always get pulled to these, and engineering is overall a good field because you're going to get a good job and make a lot of money afterwards. And it's a practical field, it's a STEM field, and I respect the STEM fields for exactly what you're saying. It is an objective field, more or less. And that's why I like, also that it hasn't been tainted by this Marxist SJW ideology yet, although they try, right? And they're trying to find, you see this rhetoric all the time, like how math is racist and blah, blah, blah. It's just all the political games, right? Evolutionary psychology, for example, is not a hard science the way engineering is, so it's easier to dismiss it, and it's harder to make concrete arguments, but you're trying to wrestle with these phenomena that you can clearly recognize. Engineering is just a very practical field, so yeah, skilled trades and STEM fields, highly recommended. They'll keep, they'll pay the bills and get you good jobs. Arts degrees, not so much. But the trade-off is you learn to think in other ways. I mean, obviously when you're an engineer, you learn to be rational and problem solve and learn objective math, and all of that is like the most important skills to a degree. But in my experience, and like I said, I've gotten to know a lot of engineers in my experience, like a lot of them aren't well-rounded and they don't know anything about stuff outside of engineering. And even today, what I would say is going on, like with certain mandates and stuff around us, a lot of really intelligent people are making really stupid decisions, and a lot of people I know that are engineers and stuff like that. And it's not that they're stupid. I mean, they're smart enough to do all the math and pass the courses. I mean, to get into these engineering programs at the university level and then graduate and stuff, it means that you are above average intelligence, because it's a filter. I mean, you to pass those tests is a filtering system. So these are above average intelligent people, but I guess they don't understand social psychology, normative conformity, how the media works, the actual history of government corruption, et cetera, and they make silly decisions all the time. So my point being is that we should all try to be well-rounded, right? I did things in a weird order, so which I wouldn't necessarily do them in the same order, but still pursue them to a degree. Like, it's set me back financially a lot over the years, significantly, because of the order I did things. But at the same time, I am glad that now, later on in life, it's in a weird way, it's about time scale preference, because after about a decade, that's when you start to see the dividends, because you're smart enough to recognize all the stuff around you that like other people aren't. It just takes a long time to start reaping benefits sometimes. So I drank coffee this morning, and I wanted to express all this before I went to do some training, because I'm in these groups and I see a lot of people that are getting triggered or playing a dishonest game often when these topics come up. And so I just wanted to clarify some of the stuff again about the difference between modern immigrants and settler pioneers, fertility rates, and immigration. The fact that I don't think we need to bring in mass immigration and replace people just to keep older people's pensions going. I think we should stop the mass immigration and work on fixing the economy for the people that already live here. I think there's a pragmatic reason we shouldn't replace the bioculture as well as an moral one. I'm not saying immigration should only be for white people at all. I'm just saying we need common sense degrees of small scale immigration, not mass immigration, which is strategic and basically weaponized at this point. And I wanted to just point out that culturally, Canada up until the 1960s was basically a biculture of Euro-Canadian peoples, French and English mostly, and First Nations Aboriginal people that were already here. That's just the reality of the history of Canada. Don't think there is. I think that covers pretty much everything I want to say and make those book recommendations. I'm going to probably do another live stream later today. And the thing I've decided is I can't make every live stream overtly political, because I would like to try to monetize or keep some of my videos monetized. So some videos I'll do and will be like this one, where I just get into an overtly political topic that clearly cannot be monetized. And then there'll be other times when I'm probably going to talk about maybe Tolkien stuff or literature later. And try to keep it specifically non-political, so that I can kind of make some content that does get monetized to support me, so I can make other, more politically relevant stuff. That's kind of like what I'm thinking right now anyway. So anyway, for the guys in the chat, super appreciate you guys joining in. Do some woodworking. I'll keep that on the list too. Next time I go home to Norfolk, I will try to get some more stuff filmed, or try to do some more on that theme for sure. Yeah, 100%, that's on the list. So thanks to everyone that was watching the stream. Super appreciate it, and I'll do another stream